Case For, a Baseball Hall of Fame podcast. I'm your host, attorney and baseball fan extraordinaire Russell Christian. On each episode of this podcast, I examine a different Major League Baseball player's career, and I make the case for whether I believe this player does or does not deserve enshrinement in the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum in Cooperstown, New York. If you're someone who has concocted your own mathematical equation in an attempt to find the perfect formula to determine whether a player belongs in the Baseball Hall of Fame, like a sports-obsessed mad scientist, then this is the podcast for you. A friendly reminder, I've never played professional baseball, I'm just a fan. I'm also an attorney, and believe me when I say it's way more fun to debate the pros and cons of a player's hall-worthiness than it is to receive surprise motions filed by opposing counsel on the night before or the day of Thanksgiving. It's happened. Don't do that, guys. Speaking of professionalism, today's superfan shout-out goes to two fans who I've recently had some great conversations with on my Twitter X account. The first is at All Aces Cards, and the second is TopSky at TopSky85. In the past week or two, I've had a lot of great and lively discussions with them and several other people on my Twitter X account about my Tommy John episode, particularly some of the player comps I've mentioned in my podcast and I've been sharing on my social media accounts. Look, I'll just say right now, I knew I was going to ruffle some feathers with some of those comps. Nevertheless, the numbers don't lie. And I intentionally picked several pitchers who are no doubt Hall of Famers, guys like Juan Marichal and Jim Palmer, and I stacked their stats, their career stats, up next to Tommy John's to see how they compare, because I wanted to demonstrate something. The point I was trying to prove was proven that obviously Tommy John didn't have the same elite peak as these two or some of the other guys I've put up there, but at the end of their careers, no matter how they got there, Tommy John put up some serious career numbers, both in terms of his counting stats and his career WAR. And look, if you had a visceral reaction to my comparisons, well then, that was my point. That was the whole point of my comparisons, to illustrate that Tommy John's final stats hold up to other all-time greats. But most importantly, I wanted to give a shout out to these two accounts because despite a lot of back and forth and clearly some differing opinions on whether or not Tommy John deserves, enshrinement in the National Hall of Fame, we all kept the conversation polite, professional, and fun. And that's my cue to go on a brief soapbox just for 1 second to say, hey everyone, look, it's just a game. The Hall of Fame is just a building. The plaques are just pieces of wood and metal. Look, we all love baseball and we all love this Hall of Fame discussion. But most importantly, let's remember, especially this time of the year, the holiday season, let's keep everything polite, professional, and be kind to each other. There's no reason for nastiness or toxicity in the Hall of Fame debate. And as long as we remember that, we're all going to have a great time. So thanks again to at All Aces Cards and TopSky85 for keeping it classy, San Diego, as Ron Burgundy would say. And I look forward to more spirited debate. If you'd like to be featured on a future Superfan shoutout, give me a follow on Twitter X at The Case For, and now my new account, Blue Sky. I've joined the people on Blue Sky at thecase4.bsky.social. The subject of our 18th episode is Luis Tiant, who sadly just passed away on October 8, 2024. As you know, I make the case for a player's induction in three parts. I look at statistics, hardware, and the fame factor. As to statistics, I look at traditional stats as well as advanced sabermetrics. With regard to hardware, I look at awards received, recognitions, honors, achievements, and I also like to look at postseason accolades. Finally, I like to explore the fame factor because I think it adds some fun, some mystery, and a little poetry to the whole discussion. Remember, we're talking about a human being who played the game, not just numbers on a spreadsheet. So, without further ado, let's make the case for Luis Tiant. Luis Tiant was born in 1940 in Marianao, Cuba, a borough of the capital city, Havana. His father, Luis Tiant Sr., was a legendary pitcher who pitched parts of 19 seasons in both Cuba and later in the Negro Leagues in the United States, where he was a member of the 1947 New York Cubans, who went on to win the Negro League World Series that year. Fellow Hall of Famer Monty Irvin once said that Luis Sr. would have been, quote, a great, great star had he been able to pitch in the major leagues. And interestingly, one of Tiant Sr.'s teammates on the 1947 New York Cubans was fellow Cuban Minnie Minoso, who of course would go on to a 20-year MLB career, mostly with the White Sox, and is now in the Baseball Hall of Fame. I mention all this not just as an aside, but to set the tone of the world that Luis Tiant Jr. grew up in and some of the adversity he faced from a young age. In fact, there's even a story about the older Tiant telling his son at one point to stop playing baseball and to find another career as there was no hope of a black man being successful in professional baseball. Now, Louis' mother still encouraged, and of course, child psychology being what it is, Luis Tiant Jr. ended up doing exactly the opposite of what his father told him to do, and indeed, from a young age, Luis Tiant Jr. wanted to follow in his father's footsteps and become a star baseball player. The big difference between the father and the son is that Luis Tiant Sr. pitched left-handed and his son pitched right-handed. Otherwise, the son learned many of the same tricks from his father, including a vast arsenal of pitches and, most importantly, exaggerated movements on the mound designed to confuse batters. The other big difference between these generational talents was that in the early 50s, after the close of Luis Sr.'s career, the Cuban Revolution began, and as a result, Cuban citizens were largely unable to travel outside of the country. That's why the Tiants were extremely excited to learn that when Luis Jr. was 16, he was named to a Cuban all-star team that was selected to travel to Mexico City for a tournament. Luis would eventually stay and sign at the age of 18 with the Mexico City Tigers, where he would pitch for the next 3 seasons and meet his eventual wife Maria at a baseball field where she was playing for her office softball team. During this time, Luis and his wife were also still able to travel to Cuba during the offseason, where Luis would play winter ball, but by 1961, political tensions had reached the point where the Castro regime banned outside travel, and upon the advice of his father in 1961, Luis did not return to Cuba for the offseason, and as a result, he didn't know when he would ever see his parents again. This is a key part of the story of Luis Tiant. Tiant would eventually join the Cleveland Indians organization. In 1962, he moved to the United States, pitching in Jacksonville, Illinois, and Charleston, South Carolina. Over the next 3 seasons, Luis pitched very well in the minor leagues, especially his 1963 season for the Single-A Burlington Indians in North Carolina, where Tiant went 14-9 with a 2.56 ERA, and led the league in complete games, strikeouts, and shutouts, and even tossed a no-hitter. Tiant continued to pitch well in 1964, going 15-1 for the AAA Portland Beavers. And in a famous call-up story, on July 18, 1964, Indians manager Bertie Tebbetts asked Tiant if he was ready to pitch in the big leagues. And when Tiant responded yes, he was told he would be starting the next day against Whitey Ford. But Tiant wasn't fazed or starstruck and pitched very well in his major league debut, striking out 11 Yankees, including Roger Maris twice, en route to a complete game shutout of the mighty Yankees. Tiant pitched well his first 4 seasons in Cleveland, and although his won-loss totals were not impressive, due in part to playing on some awful Cleveland teams, he nevertheless had good ERA and strikeout totals that were respectable. And between 1965 and 1967, he averaged a 3.03 earned run average and 172 strikeouts a season. But this would all be the prelude to his breakout 1968 season, where, in the famous Year of the Pitcher, he would lead the American League in wins above replacement with 8.5, earned run average with 1.60, shutouts with 9, ERA plus with 186, fielding independent pitching with 2.04, and led all of Major League Baseball in hits per 9 inning with 5.3, and tallied a 21-9 record for the third-place Indians en route to his first All-Star appearance and a 5th-place finish in the American League MVP voting. On paper, however, 1969 would be a reversal of fortune as Tiant posted a disastrous 9-20 record, leading all of Major League Baseball in losses, home runs allowed, and walks. Nevertheless, he still posted a respectable 3.71 ERA and struck out 156 batters and 249.2 innings. Now, many of his supporters will point out the fact that this bad season was due to adjustments to the smaller strike zone and lowered mound following the 1968 season, and that is true, but to be fair, it is worth noting that fellow 1968 pitching stars Bob Gibson and Denny McLain both had outstanding 1969 seasons, with McLain actually winning a 2nd straight Cy Young Award, and Gibson winning 20 games with a 2.18 ERA and a 10.4 wins above replacement or WAR. So yes, it is true that Tiant had to adjust to a smaller strike zone and a lowered mound in 1969, but to be fair, so did every other pitcher in the league and all the other stars in Major League Baseball, and some of those continued to pitch well in 1969, whereas Tiant really struggled to adjust that season. Now, I mentioned all this not to pick on Tiant, but just to be fair, and I'm not the only one who has pointed this out, but in this 3-year stretch of 1969 and 1971, and what should have been the start and maybe the prime of his career, this really had a big impact on Tiant's Hall of Fame chances. Indeed, in 1970 for the Minnesota Twins, he went 7-3 with a 3.40 ERA. And in 1971, his first season with the Red Sox, he went 1-7 with a 4.85 ERA and a negative .4 WAR, or wins above replacement. It's worth noting that Tiant finished 21 wins short of 250 for his career. We'll get into that in the stats. I think it's fair to say that if he had adjusted and pitched even as an average or even above average pitcher in those 3 seasons, he probably would have picked up 21 extra wins in those 3 seasons to get to 250, which may have pushed him over the mark to get in the Hall of Fame, and may have already been in the Hall of Fame already. So again, not to beat a dead horse, but 3 not just bad, but in the case of 1969 and 71, pretty catastrophically bad seasons. And what otherwise could have been the start or even the prime of his career, I think right out of the gate really hurt his Hall of Fame chances, despite his great 1968 season. And it's frankly, I think, the reason why he's still on the ballot and we're still talking about him, as opposed with him having been enshrined years ago and us talking about him as one of the all-time greats, which to a lot of people he still is. So anyway, I digress, but fortunately for Luis Tiant and his Hall of Fame chances, 1972 represented a return to form, and Tiant led all of Major League Baseball in earned run average with a 1.91 ERA. Now, the sports writers took notice, and Tiant finished 6th in the Cy Young voting that year and 8th in the MVP race of 1972. Tiant also led the American League, in ERA plus with 169 and finished with a 15-6 record. Now, 1973 and 74 saw Tiant earning second and third 21 seasons, and in 1973, Tiant led the American League in WHIP. Tiant would also make his second All-Star team in 1974 and finished 4th in the AL Cy Young voting and 11th in the AL MVP voting. Tiant also pitched 25 complete games in 1974 and led all of Major League Baseball in shutouts in 1974 with 7. Now, 1975 saw Tiant's ERA jump to 4.02, but he managed a very strong 18-14 record for the eventual AL champion Red Sox, and he pitched very well in the postseason that year, which is something we're going to discuss in the hardware factor. You got to talk about Tiant's 1975 postseason, but more importantly, 1975 was a key season in Tiant's career, as it would mark the first time in over 14 years in which Louis would see his father, Luis Sr. Now, the story, just like in the Tommy John and the Dick Allen episodes, I said there's a lot to get into. I'm going to give you the short version. The story is really a remarkable one. It's worth reading. The story behind this reunion is really an incredible one. The brief version is that in May of 1975, United States Senator George McGovern visited Cuba and brought with him a letter from United States Senator Edward Brooke III of Massachusetts, which made a personal plea to Fidel Castro that Tiant's parents be allowed to visit Boston and see their son pitched. What followed was a kind of a protracted set of negotiations and political wrangling, which is, again, really its own book or movie in and of itself. But on August 21st, 1975, Luis Tiant's parents landed at Boston's Logan Airport, where they were greeted by the emotional Tiant, his wife, and his 3 children. Another highlight of this reunion came on August 26, 1975, when the Red Sox introduced Tiant's parents to the crowd and asked Luis Tiant Sr. to throw out the first pitch. Now, if you know the story, you know it. It's a famous story about this first pitch. This is a great story. Luis Tiant Sr. was apparently wearing a full suit and tie and standing from the mound, and he threw a pitch that was just a bit outside. So, unsatisfied, he asked for the ball back, took off his coat. That's when he knew things were about to get wild. And he proceeded to throw a perfect strike to catcher Tim Blackwell. And as the fans went wild, as the story goes, Tiant Sr. told his son that he was, quote, ready to pitch 4 or 5 innings if necessary. So that's a great story about Luis Tiant Sr., who, as I mentioned, Monty Irvin said he would have been a star. That was certainly an emotional moment for Luis Tiant Sr. So Luis Tiant Jr. would go on to win 21 games in 1976, and together with his 3.06 earned run average, Tiant would be named to his 3rd and final All-Star team and finished 5th in the Cy Young voting and 26th in the MVP voting. But also marked Tiant's final, what I would call Hall of Fame-worthy season, although he would still continue to pitch well in 77, 78, and 79, posting over a 600 win-loss percentage in each of those 3 seasons. The 1979 season was a huge turning point for Luis Tiant, as he had signed with the New York Yankees in the offseason. As the story goes, the Red Sox had only offered a 1-year contract, and the Yankees offered a 2-year, so Luis went with the Yankees. There's another story about this that Red Sox Hall of Famer Collier Yastrzemski, when he heard the news, he cried and said, the quote, "They tore out our heart and soul." So that just goes to show you how well he's respected and loved by his teammates. We'll get into that in the fame factor discussion. But Luis Tiant was eventually released by the Yankees in 1980 after his 2-year contract expired. He pitched 2 final seasons in 1981 and 1982 with the Pittsburgh Pirates and the California Angels, only winning 2 games each season. He'd retire after the 1982 season, which brings us to the first part of our Hall of Fame analysis, his career statistics. Luis Tiant played 19 seasons in Major League Baseball. His career counting stats, as we call them, very impressive, is a 229 and 172 win-loss record for 67th all-time for wins with the 229 wins. His .5711 win-loss percentage is 256th all-time. His 3.30 earned run average is 310th all-time. His 2,416 strikeouts is 48th best all-time. His 187 complete games is 157th best all-time. And his 49 shutouts are tied for 21st all-time. His 3,486.1 innings pitched is tied for 73rd all-time. So right out of the gate, if you're sort of a Hall of Fame observer and if you're into counting stats, nothing really jumps off the page. The two that stands out for me in terms of his all-time ranks, the strikeouts, 2,416 strikeouts, 48th best all-time. And the big one for me is the 49 shutouts, tied for 21st all-time. That's really, to me, if we're looking just at these counting stats, that's the stat that pops out for me, the 49 career shutouts. It's tied for 21st all-time with Don Drysdale, Fergie Jenkins, and Early Wynn, all of whom, of course, are in the Hall of Fame. And just anecdotally, Fergie Jenkins was also known as a complete game guy, a shutout guy. So I thought it was interesting that Luis Tiant had the same amount of career shutouts as Fergie Jenkins. Great pitcher. In fact, I thought this was also interesting, too. Every other pitcher with more career shutouts than Luis Tiant is in the Hall of Fame. And many of the pitchers with less career shutouts than Tiant are also in the Hall of Fame or, Hall of Fame caliber pitchers, including Roger Clemens and Tommy John at 46 shutouts. I thought it was interesting, too. I'm going to read a list of some Hall of Famers with less career shutouts than Luis Tiant. Whitey Ford, Addie Joss, Phil Niekro, Robin Roberts, Red Ruffing, all with 45 shutouts. Also, there's Bob Feller, Catfish Hunter, Mickey Welsh, Chief Bender, Jim Bunning, Sandy Koufax, Randy Johnson, Lefty Grove, and Greg Maddux. All these pitchers have less career shutouts than Luis Tiant. So to me, again, the counting stat that jumps out is the 49 shutouts, tied for 21st all-time. That's where you kind of get my attention, and I think the attention of a lot of other Hall of Fame voters. I also thought it was interesting, non-Hall of Famer, but a contemporary pitcher. We'll be discussing a couple times here in the comparison. Vida Blue, who has his own Hall of Fame case and was a fellow American League star pitcher from the 70s, has 37 career shutouts, so less than Luis Tiant. As you know, I often like to look at players' counting stats and compare them with other players who have certain combinations of stats. And I know that this can be kind of wonky and maybe a bit of a slippery slope, but at the end of the day, counting stats don't lie. So I like to look at this to see where people stack up, especially in the case of players like Luis Tiant who don't hit some of the traditional benchmarks. He doesn't have 300 wins. He doesn't have 3,000 strikeouts. But nevertheless, he's got an impressive body of work. And I try to do this not to sort of change, move the goalpost or anything, but I'm trying to show that in the totality, when you take some of the markers that a player hits, it's like these are still impressive milestones. And when you look at certain statistical milestones that they hit, it's like, okay, there's only a certain amount of players that have done that. So I think it's important. I think it's big. And I also think it just is a way to sort of see a player's stats from a different light when you put them together and then rank them with the all-time greats. So in the instance of Luis Tiant, I'm just going to start with the big three pitching stats, wins, strikeouts, ERA. Let's see where he stacks up in some of the categories in terms of some of the milestones he's hit. I'm going to start with wins and strikeouts, specifically pitchers with 225 or more wins and 2,400 or more strikeouts. There's 30 pitchers in MLB history with 225 or more wins and 2,400 or more strikeouts. And while, a lot of people might say, 30, we're getting pretty elite. It certainly is an elite list, but I will say there are some non-Hall of Famers on the list and probably some who won't make the Hall of Fame. I will say the list includes non-Hall of Famers Clemens, who we've talked about Clemens before. He's certainly a Hall of Fame caliber pitcher. He's not in for other reasons. Also features current players Justin Verlander and Zach Greinke, who I think, Verlander will definitely get in. I think Greinke is going to get in the Hall of Fame. Let's see. I hope he comes back next season. I think he's trying to get that 3,000th strikeout, so I hope he signs and pitches next year. I wish him the best. Also on that list is CC Sabathia, who's on the ballot this year, the Baseball Writers Association of America ballot. I think he's going to get in this year. And if he doesn't get in next year, if he doesn't get in this year, he's definitely going to get in next year. But this list, before I digress, also includes some non-Hall of Famers. Frank Tanana, who I don't think he's ever going to get in the Hall of Fame. Bartolo Colon, who got less than 5% of the vote last year, dropped off the ballot. Andy Pettitte, who's on this year's ballot, he got 13.5% of the vote last year. I don't know if he's going to get in. He's got some off-field, some PED allegations and stuff. It's also Jamie Moyer, great pitcher, pitched a long time, but I don't think he's going to get in the Hall of Fame. So I mentioned all this to say, look, that statistical category that we talked about, 225 or more wins and 2,400 or more strikeouts, certainly puts him in some elite category. But of those, I've picked the last four, Tanana, Colon, Pettitte, and Moyer. There's four guys on the list that I think are probably never going to get in the Hall of Fame. So this doesn't necessarily make Tiant an automatic, but it does show, hey, these are impressive milestones, and a lot of the guys who have hit those milestones are in the Hall of Fame. So certainly very good company for Tiant, but not necessarily the ultra elite company that would really have a wow factor to get someone's attention and maybe warrant automatic induction to Cooperstown. So, can we place Tiant in sort of that upper register of pitchers if we look at his career stats? I think we can. Let's narrow this down a bit to the big three. Let's look at wins, strikeouts, and earned run average. Of all the pitchers with 225 or more wins, 2,400 or more strikeouts, and a career ERA of 3.30 or less, there's only 17 pitchers. All of them are in the Hall of Fame except for Roger Clemens, Justin Verlander, and Luis Tiant. Verlander's going to get in. Clemens might get in someday. There's some off-field issues, and we'll talk about that, but he's certainly one of the best pitchers in baseball history. So that's pretty elite territory right there. 225 or more wins, 2,400 or more strikeouts, and a career ERA of 3.30 or less. Tiant's the only guy in there that's not in the Hall of Fame. We're not going to get in the Hall of Fame because, PED issues. Clemens, Verlander's going to get in. So that puts him in pretty exclusive territory. Now, if you want to get ultra exclusive here, if we look at those 17 pitchers on that list with 225 or more wins, 2,400 or more strikeouts, and career earned run averages of 3.30 or less, and we look at the pitchers who've thrown 49 or more shutouts, like Luis Tiant, we have a list of only 11 pitchers in Major League Baseball history. I'm going to read it off to you. Cy Young, Walter Johnson, Tom Seaver, Christy Mathewson, Gaylord Perry, Warren Spahn, Steve Carlton, Nolan Ryan, Bob Gibson, Don Sutton, and Luis Tiant. Now we're getting somewhere. It's a pretty exclusive list. Of course, all of these guys there, these are Hall of Famers right here. So pretty exclusive list, if we do say so myself. So again, I say this every time, you can look at the list and you can tweak the numbers to get people in some categories and some stuff, but still, this is a pretty elite list. And I'm going to show you, just to show you how good Tiant was and how well the advanced statistics kind of help. If you look at that list of 11 pitchers, Tiant has the 9th best ERA plus and WHIP, the 6th lowest hits per 9 innings, and the 5th highest K per 9 rate. So, in the advanced statistics, in terms of the people on that list, he fares pretty well. Now, just to be fair, he ranks last in that list in BWAR, or Baseball Reference Wins Above Replacement, but he ranks just behind Don Sutton, who has 66.7, so just a 0.6 difference in WAR, which is wild, considering that Don Sutton has 324 career wins and 3,574 strikeouts, but WAR can do some crazy things. We'll probably do an episode on WAR. It can be great, it can be also bad, it's kind of weird, but apart from Sutton and Tiant, though, every other pitcher on that list does have a career WAR of 80 or higher, including 4 pitchers on that list with WARs of 100 or higher. So I say all this to qualify that while we've got Tiant now, we've done this job of getting him on this exclusive list, if we narrow it down based on these advanced statistics, he's still kind of in the middle of the pack, and he's at the bottom of the list in the WAR. And also in terms of the counting stats, we got him on this list, but his 229 career wins are by far the lowest on there. Bob Gibson's the second lowest, 251 wins. Everybody else in there has got 300 or more wins. And most of these guys have 3,000 more strikeouts. So he's at the bottom. We got him onto this list. I think of the Garth Brooks song, I showed up in boots and ruined your black tie affair. It's like, we got Luis Tiant in the party, but in terms of the counting stats, there's a vast difference, certainly, between some of his counting stats and some of the counting stats of the all-time greats we discussed, and the career wars of some of those all-time greats we discussed. So while he's in elite territory with 225 or more wins, 2,400 or more Ks, a career ERA of 3.30 or lower, and 49 or more shutouts, he's kind of just barely in that territory and considerably lower than some of the other pitchers on that list in career wins, strikeouts, and WAR. So speaking of WAR, let's take a deep dive into Tiant's advanced statistics. He's got a career B WAR, Baseball Reference, wins above replacement, 66.1. It's 136th all-time among all players, and just under that 70 to 75 sweet spot. But his career WAR for pitchers is 65.6, which is 44th best all-time among pitchers. And get this, I thought this was really interesting. Better than Hall of Famers Roy Halladay, Bob Feller, Amos Russi, Ed Walsh, Mickey Welsh, Dazzy Vance, Dennis Eckersley, Juan Marichal, Don Drysdale, and podcast favorite Rube Waddell, and fellow ballot mate and subject of episode 17, Tommy John. Tiant's adjusted ERA plus is 114, which is tied for 247th all-time, so it doesn't really move the needle or help his case. Likewise, his career strikeout to walk ratio is 299th all-time. His strikeouts per 9 innings rate is 316th all-time. His whip is 157th all-time. His fielding independent pitching is 394th all-time. His adjusted pitching runs is tied for 98th all-time. His base out runs saved is 74th all-time. His wins probability added is 75th all-time. His championship wins probability added by pitchers is 71st all-time. And his base out wins saved is 68th all-time. So pardon me as I go through a recitation of his all-time leaderboard and some of these advanced statistics. I mention all of this not to put you to sleep, but just to show, in terms of the advanced stats, they really don't, advanced stats, they really don't place him atop any leaderboards or in any territory all-time that screams Hall of Famer to me. But one advanced stat, though, that does seem to help his case considerably is JAWS. We've talked about this before. It's the Jaffe WAR score system created by baseball writer Jay Jaffe. And it's a quantitative means of measuring a player's Hall of Fame worthiness. It's kind of a joke I made at the beginning of the episode. Baseball mad scientists trying to concoct, like alchemists, trying to find, an element that screams Hall of Famer. I'm joking, but I have my own method, which is very unscientific, the stats, hardware, fame factor. Jay Jaffe did a great job of trying to come up with sort of a quantitative means of looking at players' Hall of Fame worthiness. It's the player's career WAR averaged with their 7 best peak WAR years, and the 7 years, they don't have to necessarily be consecutive. So it kind of averages the career WAR with the 7 best years WAR. So it's a way also, I think he was trying, I never talked to him about this, but I think he's trying to compute, the conversation of compilers and short peak guys, so say, okay, you got this big career WAR versus your 7-year peak. Did you have an elite peak? Because that's kind of the knock on some guys. They have good career numbers, but it's like, they're never elite at their peak. So it's a really interesting stat, and it's a fun one that I like to get into when we're sort of going down the rabbit hole of advanced statistics, trying to make a guy's Hall of Fame case like we are right now. So for Tiant, he ranks 59th amongst starting pitchers in JAWS with a score of 55.1. Now, according to an article from SABR, the Society of American Baseball Research, players with a JAWS score above 60 have better than 80% chance of being enshrined and therefore are likely candidates, and players with JAWS between 40 and 60 are, quote, uncertain candidates, which of course doesn't really help us at all here. It just places Tiant smack dab on that borderline that he's kind of been on the whole time in terms of his statistics, but fortunately for Tiant, this Hall of Fame discussion isn't an exact science, and there's also many other starting pitchers with a lower career JAWS score that are in the Hall of Fame, including Dazzy Vance, Red Ruffing, Jim Bunning, John Smoltz, Rube Waddell, the aforementioned Don Sutton, and Mordecai Brown. Man, old Three-Finger Brown is getting a lot of press coverage in my Tommy John episode, which makes me happy. I actually have an old baseball card from when I was a kid of Three-Finger Brown. I always thought he had a cool nickname. There's a cool story behind him. Lost some fingers fingers, and I think it was like a mining accident or something. Changed the way he pitched, and apparently he's a great pitcher. And I just said it on my Tommy John episode, he's immortal in baseball history for being mentioned in the Simpsons episode. Remember the Simpsons episode when Mr. Burns puts together the softball team of all the ringers, Major League Baseball players. He initially has a first squad he wants to put together of players that are all been dead for years, and he wants Mordecai Three Finger Brown on the team. So anyway, I digress. But he is in the Hall of Fame. He was a good pitcher. So while Tiant's Jaws score doesn't hit the 60 that Saber says, basically puts him in the Hall. He's at 55.1, so just underneath that Jaws score. Finally, I've mentioned this in a few other episodes. Baseball Reference has their own quantitative measurements used to try and gauge a player's quote-unquote Hall worthiness. And on those scales, Tiant ranks as follows. There's the black ink scale, which the average Hall of Famer has a 40, according to Baseball Reference. He places, he's got a 13, so doesn't hit the mark for that one. For the gray ink score, Baseball Reference says a score of 185 is average Hall of Famer. Tiant's at 112. There's a Hall of Fame monitor number with 100 or more being likely Hall of Famer. Tiant's at 97, so just underneath there, right at it. And there's also a Hall of Fame standards number Baseball Reference has, and the average Hall of Famer is at 50. Tiant's at 41, so just below. So again, none of these advanced statistics really help Luis Tiant's case, and they just kind of place him, again, smack dab in the middle of that fence in terms of his Hall of Fame case that he's really been on ever since he retired. That's why I mentioned earlier, I kind of took a segue into when I was talking about his biography, his career stats. Those 3 seasons where he was kind of adapting to the new strike zone, lower mound, really kind of hurt his Hall of Fame cases. If he got it together, look, I didn't pitch in the major. Pitching is hard, adjusting is hard, but had he had 3 good or above average, or certainly Hall of Fame worthy seasons, they would have put his numbers, I think, in Hall of Fame territory. So those 3 seasons kind of hurt him. I'll mention, too, another neat feature that Baseball Reference does is they compare a player's scores to other similar players. And I'll just say, look, when you go down the rabbit hole of players' careers, if you're doing it right, chances are you've already come across some of these players, as I've mentioned on some of my stat comparisons here in this episode. But I'm not opposed to a little help, a little AR or whatever. And the Hall of Fame pitchers that Baseball Reference lists as similar pitchers to Tiant are Catfish Hunter, Jim Bunning, Don Drysdale, and non-Hall of Famer Vida Blue, who, as I previously mentioned, has his own Hall of Fame case, but more importantly for our purposes, is a star pitcher of the 70s in the same league as Tiant. I always like to compare guys to contemporaries whenever possible. I know sometimes it's hard to get an exact career overlap, but, different eras, the game is played differently, the ball's different, the bat's different, the parks are different, so when I'm doing player comps, I try to compare guys from the same generation. Vida Blue, again, not in the Hall of Fame, but certainly a great pitcher and pitched in the same league in the same time as Tiant, so a good comparison case. And as I am trying to do now, to make this a little more interactive, I'm going to be posting some of these player comparisons on my social media pages, so you can take a look at these player comps, talk amongst yourselves. If you have good things to say and you're kind, I'll mention you on a future Superfan shout out. So, as Mike Myers said on Saturday Night Live, talk amongst yourself as to whether you think Tiant stacks up with some of these all-time players. Now, it's funny, I have, as I mentioned, Jay Jaffe has his sort of scientific way of quantifying the Hall of Fame. I have my very unscientific way of analyzing whether I think a player belongs in the Hall of Fame, and that's my stats, hardware, and fame factor. I like to look at those two because it kind of reminds me, if you've ever seen the movie with Robin Williams, The Dead Poets Society, there's a scene in the beginning of that movie when he's an English teacher at this private school, and these kids are reading a section from the book, the very beginning of the poetry book, on how to grade poetry. And it has like a graph in terms of substance and meter, and it shows this quantitative method to determine whether or not a poem is good. And if you've seen the movie, I'm not going to spoil the rest of the movie, but I'll say this scene. Robin Williams famously tells all the kids, hey, rip that page out, and he has them throw it away. And then he has a cool little speech, which I'll butcher if I try to paraphrase it, but he gets down and starts talking to the kids about poetry and, how the drinking up the rich poetry and all this. He has a great little speech there. So I like to get into my analysis because I love what Jay Jaffe's doing, and it is great because a lot of this is primarily a stat-based analysis, but I gotta go outside the numbers, and I look at hardware and fame factor, which this is a great time for me to segue into hardware, the next component of my Hall of Fame case for Luis Tiant. Now, we've discussed before how hardware can be a very subjective analysis. And in Tiant's case, the numbers really support that opinion because he did have a really good peak. He had a lot of really good seasons. But if we're looking at hardware in terms of making the Hall of Fame case, the hardware doesn't help Luis Tiant. He was a three-time All-Star, but that's not to say he only had 3 good seasons. As I've done before, some of our episodes, some of our players, there's some notable omissions. Tiant was a notable omission from the All-Star team in 1972, a season in which he led all of Major League Baseball in earned run average with a 1.91 ERA, and he led the American League in ERA plus with 169. He also finished that season with a 6.5 WAR, which is his 3rd highest individual WAR season of his career. That's B-WAR. But those numbers still did not earn him an All-Star nod in 1972, nor did he make the All-Star team in 1973, a season in which he won 20 games and led the American League in WHIP. But retroactive All-Star voting is a slippery slope, and even if he made the All-Star team in 72 and 73, that would make 5 All-Star teams, and to be fair, there's just a lot of players out there with 5 or more All-Star appearances who are not in the Hall of Fame and probably won't be in the Hall of Fame. So if you're someone, and I mention all this because Hall of Fame voting, I read every year. I read writers from the Baseball Writers Association of America, and they point to All-Star voting as a huge factor in their consideration. So if that's something that's important to you, Luis Tiant's 3-time All-Star selection is just not going to get him in the Hall of Fame. Let's just call it like it is. Likewise, while the process is, again, admittedly subjective, another knock on Tiant is the fact that he never won a Cy Young Award. But just to demonstrate how wonky and subjective, Cy Young voting can be, especially the further back you look in baseball history when they didn't really, have the advanced statistics. In 1968, Luis Tiant led the American League in ERA and shutouts, but ultimately the AL Cy Young Award went to Denny McLain, who famously won 31 games that season. Now, I'm not saying he shouldn't have won, but I thought this was interesting. I looked online, and I can't find any vote totals for the 1968 Cy Young other than notes that McLain won the Cy Young unanimously. So as far as I've been able to find out, we don't know where Tiant finished in the Cy Young race of 1968, nor anyone else besides Denny McLain, although it's fair to assume he would have finished very high in that race since Luis Tiant did finish 5th in the American League MVP voting that season, with 2 pitchers finishing ahead of Tiant, MVP winner Denny McLain and Dave McNally. So it's fair to assume he probably finished 3rd in the Cy Young voting that season. If you have any information about this, let me know. I couldn't find anything. I don't know if they just didn't keep track of the votes that season, or Denny McLain got all the votes and they didn't. I don't know what happened, but it's kind of unfair because lots of times I'll say, hey, he has 5 number 2 finishes or something. We don't know where he finished that season. He probably would have finished in the top 3, so he certainly had a good season. But Luis Tiant also finished in the top 5 in Cy Young voting in 1974 and 76th and 6th in the Cy Young voting in 1972. He received MVP votes in 4 seasons. That's 1968, 72, 74, and 76. Now, again, retroactive Cy Young and MVP voting is a slippery slope, but it's worth noting that Tiant did not receive any, as far as I could tell, Cy Young votes in 1973, a season in which he won 20 games and led the American League in WHIP. So, by modern standards, he probably would have received some votes, but again, it's a slippery slope, and it's fair to say that if hardware is a big factor in your Hall of Fame consideration, Luis Tiant's 3 All-Star nods and his lack of a Cy Young or MVP award just don't help his Hall of Fame case. Now, one thing here that does help his Hall of Fame case, as you know, when I look at hardware, I like to look at postseason performance. And for some, this might be the biggest factor in Luis Tiant's Hall of Fame case, so I got to get into it. Fortunately for Tiant, he pitched very well in the postseason. He only had 2 appearances. In his 1970 ALCS appearance notwithstanding, he was very good. Now, I got to mention briefly, in 1970, while he was pitching for the Minnesota Twins, he appeared in 1 game during the ALCS, faced only 4 batters in relief, and gave up a 2-run home run, and would eventually be an 11-3 bloodbath by the Orioles over the Twins. So, not really going to count that. His other season pitching in the postseason was 1975, and that was not only a great postseason for Luis Tiant, but really a huge part of his legacy. So let's get into that. The only other year in which he pitched in the postseason was 1975. He pitched in the 1975 ALCS against the mighty Oakland Athletics, who, as you remember, he won the World Series the 3 previous seasons, 72, 73, and 74. So this was a real team. This is the real deal here. Tiant pitched and won the critical Game 1, early in a complete game and allowing only 3 hits, 3 walks, and 1 run while striking out 8. And it's worth noting that Athletics lineup featured 2 Hall of Famers, Reggie Jackson and Billy Williams. So he was lights out in Game 1. The Red Sox would eventually sweep the A's during the 1975 ALCS, winning 3 games in the best-of-5 series, with Tiant getting that critical Game 1 complete game victory. But this will be a prelude, of course, to the 1975 World Series against the other baseball juggernaut of the 70s, the Cincinnati Reds, a.k.a. the Big Red Machine. And they had already won NL pennants in 70, 72, and now in 1975, they were hungry for their first World Series title of the decade. The Red Sox, of course, as you recall, were appearing in their first World Series since 1967, and very famously had not at that point won a World Series since 1918, and were very eager to break the curse of the Bambino. Not to spoil it, but as you know, it took them until 2004 to break that curse of the Bambino. But in 1975, they came very close, and Luis Tiant did everything he could to help them win the World Series that year. The Red Sox hopes to break the curse were placed squarely on the shoulders of Tiant that year, who started Game 1 at Fenway Park and gave the performance for the ages. He threw a complete game shutout and allowed only 5 hits and 2 walks while striking out 3 against a Reds team that featured 3 Hall of Famers and notable non-Hall of Famers Pete Rose, Dave Concepcion, George Foster, and Ken Griffey. Of course, Rose has his talent for Hall of Fame, is not in for off-field issues, and Concepcion, Foster, and Griffey certainly had at various points in their career Hall of Fame talent, and indeed I'll have 3, compelling Hall of Fame cases. But I mentioned all this to say, look, that Big Red Machine lineup was no joke. It was essentially an entire offensive lineup comprised of Hall of Fame level talent. So to hurl a complete game shutout against them during the World Series is just an amazing achievement, and Luis Tiant's performance in Game 1 of that 1975 World Series, for a lot of people, is kind of the highlight reel of his World Series case. And if that's not on the highlight reel, 4 days later, pitching on only 4 days rest, on October 15, 1975, Tiant started Game 4 of the World Series on the road at Riverfront Stadium, with the Reds leading the series 2-1. He got into a little bit of trouble early, giving up 2 runs in the first and then 2 more runs in the 4th inning, but he settled in after the 4th and didn't allow another run. He eventually pitched another complete game and struck out 4 en route to his second win of the World Series to tie the series at 2 games apiece. With the Red Sox eventually down 3-2 in the series, Tiant again got the start in Game 6 at Fenway Park, but didn't have the dominance of his earlier 2 games, gave up 11 hits and 6 earned runs over 7 innings. But fortunately for Tiant and the Red Sox, Tiant didn't get the loss, and relief pitcher Rick Weiss eventually took home the win, courtesy of catcher Carlton Fisk's famous walk-off home run in the bottom of the 12th inning. If you're a baseball fan, you're obviously familiar with this famous, iconic home run. If you're not a baseball fan, or you're just a casual baseball fan, you still probably are aware of this. It's one of the most iconic moments in baseball history. No doubt you've seen that video, Carlton Fisk jumping in the air, waving his hands as if to motion the ball fair. And this home run is, of course, described by Robin Williams and Matt Damon during the famous therapy scene in the movie Good Will Hunting. But long story short, Fisk gets the glory, and deservedly so, but you can't forget, Tiant pitched 7 innings of that game and had 2 wins previously in that World Series, so pitched very well in that 1975 World Series. Unfortunately for the Red Sox, the Reds would eventually take Game 7 and win the series, but Tiant, of course, he didn't pitch in that game. And in the aftermath of the 1975 World Series, that World Series was quickly recognized as one of the best, if not the best, World Series in history. Even still to this day, people hold the opinion that the 1975 World Series was the best of all time. That was interesting. A 2003 poll by ESPN ranked it the second best World Series ever, behind the 1991 World Series. And look, as a Braves fan, I don't want to get off on it, but I'm still mad we lost the Twins, but I will agree, 91 World Series is the best ever, objectively. And as a Braves fan, I wish they won, but it was still a great series. And in 2020, Sam Miller of ESPN ranked the 1975 as the best World Series ever, so still just a few years ago. As an aside, I see a lot of these lists. You can Google them too. I see 2016 popping up as number 1, number 2, or number 3. That was the year, of course, the Cubs broke the curse. And 2004, even though I thought as an actual series it was sort of not as great. It was exciting to see the Red Sox break the curse. But yeah, 1975, a lot of people think is one of the greatest. It's a subjective, analysis for sure, but still one of the greatest World Series ever. And I mentioned all this is you can't have the discussion of the 1975 World Series without mentioning Luis Tiant's 2 complete game victories. So that's just a huge component of Luis Tiant's career and, of course, his Hall of Fame case. So sorry, here's a bit of a lengthy discussion about Luis Tiant's postseason pitching, but I mentioned all of this just as I said, it's just a huge component of his Hall of Fame case. And his 2 complete game victories and arguably the most legendary World Series in baseball history is something that you just can't ignore when you're looking at his Hall of Fame case at all. So I mentioned all this. Some of the players we discussed have little to no postseason experience, or even worse, bad postseason experience. I mentioned that in my Billy Wagner episode. I knocked him a bit. He didn't pitch well in the postseason. So, in the eyes of many, Tiant's performance in 1975 cemented his legacy as just one of the best postseason pitchers of all time. And this is just an excellent segue into our final factor, the fame factor. This fame factor of Luis Tiant. This is a great episode to talk about the fame factors. I've made 2 Robin Williams movie references with regard to poetry. One is Dead Poet Society, where they talks about the inability to quantify mathematically how beautiful a poem is. The other being Good Will Hunting, where Robin Williams emotionally talks about the 1975 World Series. So it's a great episode here to be talking about the fame factor. With regard to this nebulous fame factor, I think Luis Tiant is another player on this classic era ballot who really benefits a lot from the fame factor. We talked about Dick Allen, Dave Parker, Tommy John. For Luis Tiant, throughout his career, he was a very likable player, a clubhouse presence who was known for being kind of a class clown, if you will, a fun, likable player. But more than that, he also offered an emotional depth to the game when you take into account the hardships he faced early in his life and his career, most notably the lengthy absence away from his parents and their emotional reunion in 1975. Speaking of 1975, this is really the year that makes or breaks Tiant's Hall of Fame case for a lot of people. As his Sabre biography says, quote, "For a few weeks in 1975, Tiant was the center of the baseball world. In addition to this emotional reunion with his parents and his outstanding postseason pitching performances that season, another highlight of Tiant's career was his September 16th start at Fenway Park against the Baltimore Orioles. At the time, the Orioles were only 4.5 games behind the Red Sox, and this marquee pitching matchup would pit Tiant versus Orioles ace Jim Palmer. In a game with reported attendance at over 40,000 people, well over the official capacity at Fenway Park, Tiant struck out 8 Orioles, including Hall of Famer Brooks Robinson, en route to a 5-hit, 1-walk complete game shutout, a performance for the ages and one for which Red Sox fans still recall chanting all night, "Louie, Louie, Louie." It's just a great story about the fame factor. When the stage was the biggest and the lights were the brightest, he pitched the best in this big game. It's a cool story. So, Tiant's life and legacy also, kind of weaves in the story of his father, and that also brings in the story of Cuban baseball, the old Negro leagues. And with regard to Luis Tiant, he was one of a wave of players, including fellow ballot mate Dick Allen, who were also part of this first wave of black players in Major League Baseball in the post-integration years after Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier in 1947. I talk about this a little bit on my Dick Allen episode. There's a great documentary entitled "A Long Way From Home, The Untold Story of Baseball's Desegregation" that discusses the hardships these players had to face, after Jackie Robinson broke into the league. It's a great documentary, and it's impossible to discuss the Hall of Fame cases of players from this era, such as Dick Allen and Luis Tiant, without discussing the challenges they faced. Another thing I've noticed when I've listened to interviews about Luis Tiant with former players, friends, teammates, he just truly sounded like a fun, likable person that players loved having on their teams. It's also noted in his Sabre biography that when the Minnesota Twins released Tiant, Luis went into the locker room to say goodbye to his teammates, and Twins publicist Tom Mee called the scene, quote, "the most forlorn experience I've ever had in baseball." He was well loved. His teammates loved him. People liked playing with him. They liked having him around. He was a fun guy. He was a good player. So it also notes, his Sabre biography also notes that Tiant's physical appearance was part of his charm. And indeed, if you look at pictures if you've never seen a picture of Luis Tiant, go look him up, Google him. Throughout most of his career, he sported a huge handlebar mustache, which just kind of made him a character, especially in the 70s. I love baseball in the 70s. Guys, had these big mustaches and stuff. 2 other guys from that era that kind of reminds me of our Hall of Famers, Raleigh Fingers, who of course had his famous, I don't know what you call it, the curly mustache, and Goose Gossage, who also sported a famous, handlebar mustache. mustache. So, having that distinctive mustache in the 70s just had him stand out as a character in baseball, like Raleigh and Goose. I thought that was kind of cool. So that adds to the fame factor. Also, too, Luis Tiant famously loved to smoke cigars. And just like some of the other guys we've discussed here who've been, the subject of iconic photographs, there's a lot of great photos out there of Tiant smoking a cigar, including a few pictures, great photos of Luis Tiant soaking in the water therapy, those hydrotherapy tubs in the locker rooms after a game, and he's got a cigar in his mouth. And there's also some funny stories about Luis Tiant that apparently he used to smoke cigars in the shower in the locker room after games. So, look, I say all this not to encourage or condone tobacco use. Kids, if you're out there listening, don't smoke. But I say all this to mention just Luis Tiant was a character. He's a well-liked player who had a great and outgoing personality that endeared him to teammates and fans. So much so that I'll say in researching for this episode, really the strongest advocates for his Hall of Fame case are Red Sox fans. He is still loved and adored by Red Sox fans and Red Sox Nation. So much so that I have to mention this. Tiant appeared in a 1983 episode of Cheers alongside Sam Malone, the fictitious bartender and former Red Sox pitcher played by actor Ted Danson. Tiant also wrote 2 autobiographies, El Tiante, The Luis Tiant Story, co-written with Joe Fitzgerald, and Son of Havana, A Baseball Journey from Cuba to the Big Leagues and Back, written with Saul Wisnia. He was also the subject of 2 documentaries, including The Lost Son of Havana, produced by Chris Meyer and the Farrelly brothers, famous comedy movie directors and Red Sox fans. And the documentary was shown at the Tribeca Film Festival, and it's got some great footage of Tiant visiting his native Cuba. I don't want to give it away. If you haven't seen it, check it out. It's kind of hard to find. It's out there on the internet. You got to look a little bit, but it's there. Check it out. The Lost Son of Havana. Now, with regard to Luis Tiant's Hall of Fame case and my ultimate conclusion and opinion, I have to say, when I was doing the research for this episode, I think this Luis Tiant Hall of Fame case is probably the most, if not the most difficult Hall of Fame case that I've assessed so far on this podcast. I gotta say, constantly when I was looking at the numbers, when I was looking at the fame factor, even some of the hardware, I just kept going back and forth between, hey, this guy's certainly very good, as we say in the baseball nerd world, Hall of very good, first ballot Hall of very good, but not quite a Hall of Famer. And I keep wavering between that and how can this guy not be in the Hall of Fame, and he should have been in the Hall of Fame already. He's not in the Hall of Fame. He's up for consideration this year. We'll talk about it in my next episode. He may get in. There's certainly an emotional pull. He just passed away, and he's in the minds and the hearts of voters. So he may get in. He's one of these players, if he gets in, I'm not going to be upset. The guy obviously had a great career, pitched well, had great postseason performances, and really endeared himself to Red Sox fans. But that's one of the cons I have to say about his Hall of Fame case is most of the chatter I'm hearing in support of Luis Tiant's Hall of Fame case is coming from a very diehard and loyal Red Sox fan base. I mean, those are the people, and that's great. We want to stump for our favorite player, but as I mentioned in my Felix Hernandez episode, the guy pitched his whole career for the Mariners. Mariners fans loved him, put him in the Mariners Hall of Fame, retire his number for the Mariners, sure. I don't think Felix is a Hall of Famer. And I gotta say, looking at Luis Tiant, looking at this sort of 3-part analysis, I don't know. I hate to say this, Red Sox fans. I get that you love. He seems like a fun pitcher. I would have loved watching him, and he was certainly a great pitcher. The fact that we're even having this discussion means he's certainly up there with the greats and one of the greats of his time period. But I gotta say, I'm on the fence. Let's look at the counting numbers again. I take great care to find these lists where I can look at a player's career counting numbers. And we looked earlier at the 225 or more wins, the 2,400 or more strikeouts, 3.30 or lower ERA, and the shutouts. And yeah, he's in that group, but he's at the bottom of that. And there's pitchers in there with considerably higher career WARs, considerably more wins, considerably more strikeouts. So we kind of got him in that group. And to some people, that might be the open shut case. To others, you might be thinking, Russ, you kind of move the goalpost to kind of get this guy on a list of the all-time greats so that you can read their names out for dramatic effect and include Luis Tiant. And I've said this before because I do this on a lot of episodes, and it is kind of funny when you have these Hall of Fame and all-time great lists. It's I've made this joke before that sometimes you see it's like, okay, all-time greats, A, B, C, D, and outlier X. There's somebody that goes in there. It's like, okay, one of these names doesn't belong. And I'm not saying Luis Tiant doesn't belong because he's in that list. But I've done that before with offensive statistics. They'll say, okay, these 4 guys, Willie Mays, Hank Aaron, Babe Ruth, and so Joey Gallo or some random. It's like these are the 4 guys with this combination of stats, and you're scratching your head thinking, Russ, you're moving the goalposts here to put Joey Gallo in a conversation with Babe Ruth and Hank Aaron. I'm making that up as an aside, but if you're going to put a lot of stock in he's on this list with these other Hall of Famers, then those 11 people, including Luis Tiant, I mentioned, again, with the 225 or more wins, 2,400 or more strikeouts, 3.30 ERA or less, and the 49 or more shutouts, to some people that might be an open shut case. I will say, I've heard people say that the advanced statistics help Luis Tiant. I don't think the advanced statistics help Luis Tiant's case. In fact, they kind of put him in the middle of the pack or towards the bottom. I think the 2 biggest things in terms of his stats that help his case are the career shutouts and the career strikeouts. I don't think the hardware helps his case at all. We can get into retroactive voting and, shoulda, woulda, coulda, but at the end of the day, he's a 3-time All-Star, never won a Cy Young Award. There's a lot of pitchers out there with Cy Young. There's a lot of pitchers, great pitchers out there with 2 or more Cy Young Awards that are not in the Hall of Fame. And of course, Roger Clemens is not in the Hall of Fame for other reasons, but Johan Santana, Brett Saberhagen, these guys have 2, Cy Young Awards, and they're not in the Hall of Fame. You look at Jacob deGrom, Blake Snell now. I mean, I don't know. We'll see how their careers pan out. I don't know if they're going to get in the Hall of Fame. I don't know. So, there's guys out there with 2 or more Cy Youngs that aren't in the Hall of Fame and may not get in the Hall of Fame. So, in terms of hardware, he doesn't have it. And yeah, in terms of the fame factor, look, I like to look at the fame factor as sort of the sizzle and the bacon. And without a doubt, he is one of the biggest personalities in baseball history. He's well loved. Yeah, I'm not denying that. And Red Sox fans love him. They got fond memories of Luis Tiant from the World Series. He pitched well. All of that. I get all of that. He's certainly, a great story. He has this emotional story of his parents, the reunion, growing up in Cuba, the connection with his father to the old era of baseball. He's just got so much wrapped into his story. But at the end of the day, there are other players that have similar stories, that faced adversity, had interesting and compelling biographies. And, an interesting, compelling biography makes you an interesting person. It makes an interesting story. It makes for a good story to tell, to learn, for future generations. But, as I say, the fame factor is kind of the sizzle on the bacon, so to speak. Really, in a lot of ways, it's a statistical analysis. And frankly, I hate to say it, I just don't know if Luis Tiant, in my book, hits the mark to get into the Hall of Fame. If anything, the 49 shutouts, again, stand out, but he's not. I don't know. I'm really torn about this, and I have to say, look, this is what I'll say. If Luis Tiant gets in the Hall of Fame, I'll be very happy for him. He has a great story. I think if I were sitting down, and we're going to talk about this in the next episode, especially with sort of the confines of the way the voting and the ballot works, I don't know if I would vote for Luis Tiant on this ballot. But I will say this, in researching this episode, I was just, again, torn back and forth on whether or not Tiant, really, again, the statistical analysis, whether or not he had the numbers to make Cooperstown. And I was prepared to give my opinion that I didn't think Luis Tiant had the numbers to merit induction into the Hall of Fame. But then I listened to a podcast, and again, I don't mind sharing. There's other podcasts out there that talk sports. There's a podcast, Planet Mikey, with Mikey Adams, who's a Red Sox fan, big diehard Red Sox fan, and he talks about Luis Tiant after his passing, and the comparison that he uses is Luis Tiant and Catfish Hunter, both stars of the 70s. And once I looked at the numbers, I'll post these on my Twitter X and my Blue Sky, and I'll give a shout out to Planet Mikey too, just so he knows I'm not just taking his stuff and running with it. I like to attribute my sources. When you look at this comparison, and you see that Catfish Hunter is in the Hall of Fame and Luis Tiant is not, I'll just break it down real quick. Luis Tiant has a career WAR of 66.1, and Catfish Hunters is 40.9. That's 26 points higher, Luis Tiant. Luis also pitched in more games, has more innings pitched, has more career wins. The ERAs are .04 away, so almost the same. Luis Tiant has a higher career ERA plus, more strikeouts, a higher strikeout percentage. So, across the board, and more shutouts. Again, we talked about the shutouts. So once I saw that, to me, again, these comparison players can be important for that reason. I didn't think that Luis Tiant had the numbers, but then I looked at Catfish Hunter, and I'm not trying to knock on him, but we're not revoting the Hall of Fame here, but it's like, geez, if this guy's in, then I think Luis Tiant needs to get in. And that gets to the conversation of, sort of small Hall and big Hall. And again, whether or not you think Luis Tiant deserves to be in the Hall of Fame, it's going to come down to your philosophical perspective in the Hall of Fame. Do you want only the elite, the best of the best going in there, or do you want people that are pretty good? And one thing I will say for Luis Tiant, he did lead the league in a lot of categories, including earned run average. That to me is a big factor. He led the league in shutouts. I like looking to see if a player leads the league in a lot of categories. So I think I will give credit to Planet Mikey when he brought up the Catfish Hunter comparison, and I looked and I saw that, and I saw they were contemporaries, the same era. That, to me, kind of sealed the deal of like, well, if he's in, then you got to have this guy in. I mentioned that on my Lou Whitaker episode. That was another player I said, just one of the most contentious Hall of Fame discussions out there is the Lou Whitaker discussion. Very passionate pros and cons in favor of and against the induction of Lou Whitaker in the Hall of Fame. And to be fair, he's not in the Hall of Fame. So if you're stumping for him, he's not in. But I mentioned, the stats comparing him and Alan Trammell, who's in, and of course they're part of that double play combination. And I made the statement that if Alan's in, Lou's got to be in. So, it's not exactly an analogous scenario because they're not teammates, they're not part of this double play combination. But if you're looking at pitchers of the 70s, star pitchers of the 70s, late 60s, early 70s, and you see that Catfish Hunter is in, it's like, well, if Catfish is in, you got to put Louis in. So I want to thank you, Planet Mikey, because once I saw that, and I also heard on your podcast and other podcasts and interviews how important Luis Tiant was to the fan base there in Boston, I think Luis Tiant would make a fine addition to the Hall of Fame. And that brings me to my final conclusion. I would vote for Louis, but again, I don't think I would vote for him on this particular ballot. What does that mean? Well, that's a nice segue into my next episode. I want to thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please check out my other episodes and stay tuned for my next episode. It's a very important one where I'm going to break down the classic era ballot, and I'm going to discuss all 8 players on the ballot, including Tiant. And I'm going to talk about kind of how the ballot works, and you can only pick so many people. And look, I will say this is one of the toughest Veterans Committee ballots we've ever seen. Everyone on there has an incredibly good Hall of Fame case, in my opinion, but you can only pick a few. So I'm going to break all of this down in my next episode. I'm going to make the predictions for who I think will get in and not get in based on the votes and based on my opinions. And we're going to talk about some of my prior episodes as well. So stay tuned. You're not going to want to miss that. And until then, remember, when life gets you down, stop what you're doing and watch a baseball game.